Welcome. Today we're going to zoom in on Article 40 DSA because it's one of the key enforcement levels for understanding and addressing systemic risks. It's the legal gateway for meaningful access to platform data and especially interesting for researchers.
A very concrete enforcement signal is the Commission's decision to fine X 120 million euros in December 2025. Among the breaches, the Commission explicitly pointed to a failure to provide researchers access to public data, so shortcomings that directly touch the Article 40 data access logic.
This is a milestone, not just rules on paper, but the DSA is entering into a more tangible enforcement phase, where transparency and data access are treated as compliance critical, not optional.
And this act of enforcement is not isolated. The Commission has also preliminarily found TikTok and Meta in breach of transparency obligations linked to researcher access to public data. Again, reinforcing the data access is becoming a frontline issue in DSA oversight. Article 40 is designed to make systemic risks monitorable in practice. It supports scrutiny of how platforms function at scale, especially where risks are not visible from the outside. The research community has been demanding access to data for decades.
The article has a dual purpose. First, regulatory access, enabling the Commission and digital service coordinators to obtain the data they need to check compliance and investigate potential breaches.
Second, vetted researcher access, enabling independent researchers to study systemic risks and evaluate whether risk mitigation measures actually work. So scrutiny is not limited to public authorities.
And scraping, according to Article 40, paragraph 12, which provides a first legal basis for collecting such scraped data solely for performing research that contributes to the detection, identification, and understanding of systemic risks.
Let's have a closer look and start with the regulator side. Article 40 allows competent authorities to demand access to data that is necessary to monitor compliance with the DSA.
Importantly, this is not only about handing over raw datasets for VLOPs and VLOCs, the obligation can also involve explaining the logic, functioning, and testing of relevant systems, including algorithmic systems, so regulators can interpret what the data means in operational terms.
There's also a strict purpose limitation. The data can only be used for assessing compliance with the DSA. So it's not a general open data mandate.
And provision explicitly recognizes constraints. Regulators must respect trade secrets and user privacy, which is where the practical balancing work often happens. Now, the researcher's side, Article 40 creates a specific legal category, the vetted researcher, because the goal is not anyone gets everything, but rather that trusted access for clearly justified projects.
The research has to contribute to detecting or understanding systemic risks under Article 34 or to evaluating risk mitigation measures under Article 35. So the scope is anchored in the DSA systemic risk framework.
The core requirements then operationalize trust and accountability, affiliation with a recognized research institution, independence from commercial interests, and transparency about funding.
Researchers must also demonstrate capacity for data security and compliance with data protection obligations, because access is only defensible if safeguards are credible.
Finally, there's a proportionality logic. The request must be necessary and proportionate for the project, aligned with systemic risk research, and coupled with a commitment to publish findings openly. So the benefit is public and not private. Practically, Article 40 builds a mediated pipeline so researchers don't negotiate access alone, platform by platform, without institutional backing.
Step 1. Researchers apply to a Digital Services Coordinator, the so-called DSC, either in their home country or the platform's country of establishment, depending on the pathway in the DSA setup.
The DSC vets the application and, if satisfies, issues a formal recent request to the platform.
That intermediation matters. It's meant to standardize access, create procedural legitimacy, and also limit requests in a structured way. So platforms are not overwhelmed by uncontrolled demands, but also can't dismiss projects informally. At the same time, Article 40 recognizes that data access has boundaries, and it explicitly lists refusal grounds.
A platform can refuse if it genuinely does not have the requested data, or if granting access would create significant vulnerabilities or expose critical trade secrets.
But refusal is not supposed to be a dead end. If access is denied, the platform must propose an alternative, for example, by providing anonymized or otherwise safer forms of access that still allow meaningful analysis.
And there's a procedural tempo. Platforms must respond within a defined time frame, so access is not neutralized through delay. Now, let's hear from our expert.
As you may know, there's two kinds of data access in the DSA. One is in Article 44, which is the data access to non-public data. And for this, we've actually just received the first decisions by Commission Namian, who's the Digital Services Coordinator for Ireland, and thus that's most of the researcher applications to non-public data, which is the data access set out in Article 44. And they seem to have rejected all applications, which means that basically now starts the second round, which can learn from these applications, and this is probably where we'll be also submitting an application. And then there's the other kind of data access, the Article 4012 data access to publicly accessible data, or data that is publicly accessible in their platform's interface by researchers. And this has already been active since February 2024, and so we have a bit more experience with it. And the data that we have gathered through our data access tracker on the GSA40 collaboratory.eu basically shows issues throughout the access process. And by access process, I define everything from the preparation to the of the application, to the submission of the application, over the vetting of the application by the platforms. So here the application is not vetted by the DSCs, but by the platforms, to the final decision, to then the actual access to the data, all right? And so in the preparation phase, we have basically an issue with the application forms, which are difficult to find, very heterogeneous, and kind of force researchers to disclose much more data than they're supposed to, and also force them to accept terms and conditions which might be pretty or which are pretty limiting and probably don't align well with the DSA. This is actually part of the decision that against X that the European Commission, or that was recently leaked by the US Republicans. And there's also part of another investigation by the European Commission into what is called burdensome procedures and tools. I'll get to the tools in a second, but the X decision also shows issues with regards to the vetting of the platforms. This is what we can also see in our tracker. So the platforms basically tend to, especially one platform, which is X, tends to vet very restrictively, in the sense that it kind of even implements delaying tactics, right? So this came also out in the X decision. It actually implements an escalation strategy where the first step is not a decision on do I accept or do I reject the application, but the first step is do I reject the application or do I ask another question back, right? And then kind of through this process, X kind of artificially prolongs the access process. So this is one problem in the access process. And then we can also see that the times to, that there's quite some variation in the times to decision. Also things that you can check on our tracker insights on our website. But assume that you're not rejected and that you actually do get access. Then you basically run into issues with the burdensome tools, which I just mentioned. So the tools through which you can actually access the data. And some platforms give you API access, right, which is probably the best, even though I can come to that later also. Others say, okay, you can scrape now, we will whitelist your IP, which kind of outsources a lot of work to the researcher. And then others again, like Meta or TikTok, may onboard you onto what they call, or what are basically specific user interfaces, graphical user interfaces for researcher data access. One is the Meta Content Library, and TikTok's is called Virtual Compute Environment. And they are rather restrictive, in the sense that they kind of filter quite a bit through until you actually can get access to the data. This is the case for Meta, which kind of applies multiple filters on the data that you can actually access there. And TikTok actually goes as far as to kind of check every query that you send through the virtual compute environment. They claim this is because you may be accessing data that is related to people that are under 18, to children, effectively, and thus this kind of extra security is necessary. But there's also this kind of also results in the fact that queries by researchers are kind of take a long time to evaluate. So you might wait 5 days so that you get an error back because you wrote the wrong query, right? And as it turns out, TikTok seems to be systematically onboarding non-academic civil society researchers onto this VCE, which again seems like a delaying tactic. So yeah, this is the state of DSA-40 data access at the moment. We don't know much about access to non-public data because we don't have any working examples yet. And there's a lot of things that we still have to figure out and kind of fix with regards to Article 4012 data. But there's a lot of researchers which are kind of coordinating on it. So if you want to join them, check out the DSA-40 Data Access Collaboratory or the Coalition for Independent Technology Research.
Finally, Article 40 also addresses a simpler but crucial scenario: research based on publicly accessible data. Here the idea is, if data is already public, the access pathways should not be artificially restricted. Platforms should not erect technical barriers that effectively block researchers who meet baseline independence and safety criteria from studying public content and interactions.
This matters because a lot of systemic risk research, like studying advertising libraries, recommender dynamics via public interfaces, or content visibility patterns, starts from what is publicly observable, and Article 40, paragraph 12 targets interference in that level.
And that brings us back to enforcement. The Commission's preliminary findings against TikTok and Meta explicitly focus on researcher access to public data, showing that public does not automatically mean practically accessible without compliance pressure. And of course, to the Commission's first fine against X for infringing Article 40. Thank you for listening and see you in the next video.